Great. Thank you very much, Kelly. And thank you all for joining me today to find out a bit more about sustainable food production and asking that question of, is it possible? So today's talk, I'm going to start off by going through some of the key reasons on why we actually need to be considering how our food is produced, and of course, food being produced in a sustainable way. And then I will be going through using examples of my own research, looking at how we perhaps should go forward in several different types of food systems to produce that food in a more sustainable way. And at the end, yes, there will be this opportunity to ask me any questions which may have arisen from the content of today's talk. So one of the key reasons on why we need to consider how our food is being produced is, of course, because we are in this climate emergency. And we are seeing these unprecedented levels of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And we are fast approaching this level where it is deemed high risk for climate stability. And so when we get to that point, then we're going to be seeing more frequent extreme weather events, so more extreme droughts, floods, etc. And ideally, we should be coming back down to around 350 parts per million, which is then deemed a more safe level for us to exist as a global population. Now, the trouble is with all these greenhouse gases is, of course, because of the associated increase in the global temperature. And so over the years, we have slowly and now more rapidly started approaching this 1.5 degree threshold, which at COP26 last November, this was the point where we didn't really want to be exceeding, just because it brings about more turmoil in our climate. But even if everything from COP26 is addressed, we are still likely to overshoot that 1.5 before then starting to come back down again. So we got some issues ahead, but we need to look forward about how we can progress things in a better way. Now, the trouble is with climate change is that with those extreme weather events, we are seeing more crop failures and also more food waste. So it could be from extreme drought, like up in this situation here, or it could be the increased incidence of tropical storms, for example. But it's not just outside the UK where this is happening. In potato fields, for example, in the UK, some of those are now flooding, and then that, of course, is rotting those potatoes in the ground where they are. But one thing that a lot of nations are not very good at doing, and that is reducing their food waste. So food which is fit for human consumption is still being wasted. Now, the Worldwide Fund for Nature have estimated that about 40% of all the food that's being produced globally is either being lost or it's being wasted. And clearly that is not good going forward, especially as we have this population increase that's being predicted, going up to 11.2 billion people by 2100. And if we are to carry on feeding that growing population, then unfortunately we are going to see an increasing proportion of the world's natural resources being used. So perhaps even greater areas of land being cultivated to produce the food that we need to consume. Now, we're all too aware of what's happened in some of the South American countries through deforestation of tropical rainforests, etc., converting that into livestock areas, growing soy, that kind of thing. But we're also claiming deserts for food production as well. So irrigating the desert so we can grow crops like potatoes in these situations. And then with that growing population, there is an increasing demand for homes for people to live in. And so once again, we are losing more of our land, more of our natural resources to these kinds of activities. And then we need all the infrastructure to facilitate the movement of people across the landscape. And the HS2 is an example of that here in the UK. So my first big question for today is, well, when will this actually stop? When will we actually say we cannot afford to lose any more of our tropical rainforests? When are we going to say we can't destroy any more of our species-rich habitats? When will we say we've got enough homes for all the people and we can't just carry on converting land into homes? And when will we say we cannot lose any more areas because it's going to dramatically affect biodiversity even more? This is the big question. When will this all end? Now, going hand in hand with a climate emergency, we also have the biodiversity emergency. And this is really being driven through that loss of habitat. And so the key thing for us in terms of food production is that we're also losing the diversity and abundance of some key species, which are actually otherwise going to help us produce the food that we need. And then there are the loss of species of conservation concern, and even the turtle dove now is on the red list, IUCN red list, and it's vulnerable to extinction, which is a crazy state to be in. And then also with climate change, we're seeing the arrival of more invasive non-native species and also the spread of new diseases. And all of this impacts on our ability to produce the food that we need. And ultimately, it is also reducing our resilience to climate change. Now, we often blame other countries for what they've done to their landscapes in destroying biodiversity, etc. But Andy Purvis and his team at the Natural History Museum only last year announced that since the Industrial Revolution, Britain has lost nearly half of all of its biodiversity. So we really do need to think about what we're doing here in the UK before we perhaps start pointing fingers at other nations. Now, one thing that we are going to need, of course, is food. Now, what we need to see, though, is that we also need to make a space for nature. And that can be by reconciling agricultural production with biodiversity. So we're not only allowing the landscape to be used for producing food, but also as a home for biodiversity, for our wildlife. So the big challenge is to increase that production from the land that we have to feed that growing population, but using sustainable approaches so that we can continue to support biodiversity in the landscape as well. So what we can term this is sustainable intensification, but you'll also hear this term of ecological intensification as well. So where we can intensify the ecological value of the landscape so that once again that is supporting our food production. So my research is all about the ecosystem services that we have for free from the natural world. So those can be goods, but they can also be services like pollination, for example. And so my research is all focused around how we can manage these agro ecosystems to support biodiversity whilst supporting the delivery of these ecosystem services. And my research to date has mainly focused on the delivery of pollination services to our crops, but also pest regulation services. So pest regulation of the pests of our crops, how we can control those. And then increasingly, it's getting around the idea of capturing more carbon into our soils and storing that in there indefinitely. So ultimately improving soil health. Now, the NFU announced that back in 2019 that they wanted to make the sector net zero by 2040. And so a lot of that is going to be achieved through agri-environment schemes like the new Environmental Land Management Scheme for England. And this is all about paying farmers to deliver on the promises of providing clean and plentiful water, but also looking at how farmers can adapt their practices to and allow them to adapt to climate change, but also reduce the impacts of climate change as well. So what we need then going forward is that, yes, we need that food production, but it also needs to support ecosystem services. So we need to be able to farm our food, produce our meat, produce our cereals, produce our fruit and veg, but also at the same time support beneficial species as well, the pollinators, the natural enemies, and also the processes which help with that, so good soil health. If we can get that right, then in return, those beneficial species will then be helping to underpin that food production. So the two are going hand in hand together. So one of the first things that we need going forward is for farmers and growers to have a reduced reliance on pesticides. We will never be in a situation where we can say they've got to stop using them completely, because at the end of the day, we simply wouldn't produce enough food from the land available if that was the case. But we do know is that if growers and farmers can reduce their reliance on pesticides, so they're not using so many of them, we will see more natural enemies of the pests that they would otherwise be trying to control. And so if we have more natural enemies in these systems, we would then have fewer pests. And if we've got fewer pests, then hopefully there is less need for further pesticide intervention. So if then those farmers and growers are using even less pesticides, then there should be even more natural enemies. Now, this cycle here is called the IPM treadmill, the Integrated Pest Management Treadmill. So we're not saying that farmers and growers have to completely stop. It's a case of not just blanket spraying all the time, just because they've always sprayed at a certain date, at a certain time of the year for the last 10, 15 years. It's more about worst case scenario, I have to spray it or I will lose my crop, and only doing it in that situation. Otherwise, having a greater reliance on natural enemies to do that job. We also need to have a reduced reliance on fertilizers. Now, that might seem a bit strange that I've said we need to be producing more food to feed a growing population. And surely if we are using fertilizers, we get bigger, stronger crops, which are going to produce more food for us to eat. Well, the trouble is with mineral fertilizers is that there is a lot of greenhouse gas emissions associated with them, from their production, their transport, and then their actual use, their application in the field. But remembering that livestock are also producing fertilizers in the form of manure, but these are also associated with greenhouse gas emissions as well. Now, one of the reasons we need to consider moving on sort of away and less reliant on mineral fertilizers, those man-made, well, human-made synthetic fertilizers, is that we are destroying the fertility of our soils, destroying the health. And back in 2014, it was announced that Britain only had about 100 years of harvesting left in its soils before they were completely depleted of their health. But then shortly after that, Michael Gove came out to say, well, no, actually, we've only got 30 to 40 years before we have completely eradicated soil fertility. So continuing to add these synthetic fertilizers to land, like what's shown in this picture here, has done us no favors. And so we really do need to think about moving away from that blanket application of them. So what we do need then is soil health. We need those healthy soils. And so we need to think about ways, alternative ways of increasing fertility in the soils. Now, in arable situations, that can be used through cover crops, like shown in this picture here, but also greater reliance on green manures. So if you start doing this on your soils, then you are going to increase the soil health, the activity of earthworms and other insects in the soil, and therefore this is going to help us produce the food that we need. We also need to think about what we are actually consuming and our demands that we are placing on the land that we have to farm. Now, you'll be aware that there is a big drive for us all to reduce our meat and dairy consumption and perhaps rely on a greater amount of plant-based foods in our diets. Now, one of the key things we need to consider with this is, well, where does that plant protein actually come from? Now, a lot of plant protein is coming from fields like this, and this is in the Amazon. And well, we know what was there previous to that soy crop there, but also we need to be thinking about the miles which those plant products are traveling to get to the UK, for example, as well. So there's lots to take on board, and I certainly don't think it's a clear case situation of saying, well, no, just completely stop eating meat and dairy. There are other things to consider if we are looking at this in terms of a sustainable approach. Now, one of the main issues with meat production is that there are greenhouse gas emissions associated with it, and this was when with the EU, so at the time EU 27, and these colleagues here in the Netherlands and Germany looked at greenhouse gas emissions depending on the livestock sector. And it's the dairy and beef which are the big hitters with regards to greenhouse gas emissions compared to poultry and laying hens, for example. Now, just to put this into context, a single dairy cow, so a high lactating cow, produces up to 600 litres of methane a day. Now, this is particularly bad because methane is about 21 times more potent than CO2. So clearly there are issues with livestock that are contributing to climate change. Now, the other thing that we have to note is that as some of these Asian countries become wealthier, they are increasing the demand which they have for meat. So it's becoming more available to them. And so that demand for meat is going up, particularly in Asia. And so one thing to consider in the UK is that even though we are able to produce a lot of meat here, we are still importing about 26% of it into the UK, mainly beef, but also pork and lamb. Now, perhaps if we are thinking about this in a more sustainable way, rather than importing New Zealand lamb, for example, why don't we just reduce the consumption of meat that we're having in the UK and actually consider just buying UK meat, supporting our British farmers and the standards that they hold dear to them in terms of the welfare of the animals and how they are producing that meat, which we are then consuming. So that's just one thing to consider. The other aspect with livestock sector is it's not just the land that's needed for them to eat the grass in the fields and things like that. It's the area of land which is also needed to produce other feeds which aren't available, say, in the winter months, so concentrates, that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of area which is needed to support those cows throughout the whole year, not just during the summer when they can go out onto the pastures, etc. Now, with this increase in demand for meat globally, that means we're going to need to have even more land being used for livestock production. And clearly this has an issue that we are using land to produce food to feed animals rather than directly to feed humans. So if we had less reliance on livestock, then we wouldn't need to have so much land for that sector. We also need to consider how we are using water. And so we know that if we are to produce enough food to take people out of poverty and provide enough food for this growing population, we are going to need to use more water, extracting that from our rivers and streams to irrigate our crops, etc., especially in a changing climate. And this, of course, is going to have big issues on our river systems and the biodiversity associated with them. So we need to consider just how much water is needed for the products that we like to consume. So giving you an example here, to produce 1 kilo of wheat, it's estimated that around 1,300 litres of water is required to produce that 1 kilo. But then when we look at producing 1 kilo of boneless beef, then we're looking at nearly 16,000 litres of water needed to produce that 1 kilo of beef. So clearly there are impacts in terms of what we're consuming, not just with the land required, but also how much water is needed. Give you some other examples here from this table here, the water footprints, and one I'm just going to highlight here, converting that glass of beer from the metric to the good 1 pint, 170 litres of water for every pint of beer that's produced. So clearly a lot of water involved in that whole process. So the big question then is that if we're going back to the point that we're being asked to reduce our consumption of meat and dairy, and some people are choosing to go vegan. Now, what would then happen if we were all to go vegan? Well, for me, I see that there is a really important role of livestock in the landscape. So here we have a lovely view across a valley in the Brecon Beacons near Abergavenny. And what you'll see here is a mixture of woodland, but predominantly grassland. Of course, the livestock industry is dependent on grassland, so cows and sheep particularly there. And so in the UK, this type of situation is what we call a plagioclimax community. So if we were to just leave it as it is, with no cutting or no mowing, eventually it would go into scrub and then into woodland. So we require herbivory, we require mowing to maintain these kinds of communities. Before we started domesticating livestock for grazing, etc., it was those large native herbivores which were doing that job for us, and cows, etc., are now what we are relying on to maintain some very important grassing communities. So if we are to say we all go vegan, does it mean then if we haven't got livestock, then we're going to lose our grass and there would be no need for grassland in the landscape? Well, it would mean that we'd have a lot more land for producing those plant-based diets. So are we going to see more oilseed rape in the landscape and other arable crop types as well? Or could it be that we continue to keep our grassland, but it goes into anaerobic digesters to produce our bioenergy? Now, the thing is, if we were to lose our livestock, if we were all to go vegan, the key thing here is that many species, ones which are really important for our biodiversity, are also dependent on grassland habitats. And so livestock are really important for enhancing grassland diversity. Through the disturbance of their hooves, the random deposition of nutrients, etc., that farmyard manure application, etc. And also in the role of seed dispersal of native species, be it in the hooves, the feces, on the wool of sheep, etc. That helps maintain the dynamics of grassland. So I see livestock having a really important role going forward as part of a sustainable future. And so we need to work with the livestock sector to maximise the benefits. We certainly don't want to end up with situations like this, what we see in America, where we have these intensive beef production systems. They do little, if anything, for biodiversity. They are doing nothing for landscape character. They're doing nothing to address the issues of climate change. And so we really do need to think about what we can do at a farm level to make this sector more sustainable. And that's exactly what the NFU want to see. They want all farmers to look at how they can manage their land in a better way to capture more carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the soils and vegetation, etc. So yeah, we need to be storing more carbon in our soils. And what you'll see in this diagram here is that herbivores are really important to help get that carbon into the soil. So those interactions between the vegetation they're eating and then that going into the manure, which then can find its way into the soil, etc. They are a vital component of our landscape for helping us to get that carbon back in the soil. The soil is so important for holding on to our carbon. It's over 3 times the atmospheric pool of carbon, and it's nearly 5 times what we find in the biotic pool. So all the plants, all the animals, etc. So soil is really important. The trouble is, because of our intensive farming techniques, etc., we have stripped out a lot of that carbon from the soil. So some soils have lost, up to 75% of their original carbon pool. And so Lau back in 2007 estimated that 15% of the global emissions of carbon dioxide at that time could be offset by managing our soils much better. So we need to look at systems like this with pastures, etc., and say, right, how can we manage those differently so that we do actually start getting more carbon back into those soils? Now, one of the key approaches, particularly on arable soils, so arable cropped soils, is to have cover crops. And that is a good way of putting more carbon back into the soil. But a key use is perennial land use, because with less soil disturbance, you are getting more carbon building up in those soils. And of course, perennial land use is associated with grasslands. Whereas if we're having these plant-based diets, they tend to be cultivated on an annual basis, releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. So perhaps we do need to be seeing more perennial land use in our landscape. And then the other aspect is that we can increase plant species richness on these soils, in these perennial land use types, etc. So rather than relying on only a few agricultural varieties of grasses, let's see what else we can include in those pastures, in those lays, so that we have that diversity of root depths, root structures, etc., and therefore putting more carbon back into that soil. And this is illustrated really nicely by David Tillman and his team, where they looked at a simple grassland situation with only 1 species and then going up to a situation with 16 species. And we start seeing this increase in carbon that is being captured and stored in the soils. So an extreme example would be to go from a species poor pasture into a species rich meadow, for example, where there would be a lot more carbon being stored. But there are more simpler approaches that farmers can do while still maintaining good productivity on their land for their livestock, etc. So there are lots of opportunities for farmers to capture more carbon and store it in the soil. So herbal lays, so rather than just a few grass species and maybe 1 or 2 legumes, let's diversify those mixes to get that variety of root structures, etc., into the soil and therefore more carbon. Look at how we can diverse those permanent pastures by adding a few more species to actually create that diversity. And then, yes, rather than continuing to destroy our species-rich meadows, let's protect those which we already have and let's create more of them. And ultimately, if we can start doing this on our arable soils as cover crops and in our perennial grassland areas, we can reduce the requirements for the fertilizers. Remembering I said we need to be doing that because the use of mineral fertilizers is over time destroying our soils. So these kinds of approaches can help us produce our food in a more sustainable way. Now, the other aspect of this, which I'm going to say a bit more about shortly, is that if we can then feed this kind of forage to our livestock, there is also the potential to reduce methane emissions from that livestock sector, which of course is one of the issues associated with them, particularly cows and also with pigs. So here we have a situation. So when I was at the University of Reading, so I was there 10 years prior to joining the University of Worcester, and I took this very species poor ryegrass pasture and I put in a wildflower seed mix to increase the diversity of that piece of land. And what we were interested in doing was saying, well, will that forage then help reduce the methane emissions of growing dairy heifers? So these are young female cows. And so we compared our wildflower pasture with the permanent pasture, which was just ryegrass, and we compared it with red clover and ryegrass and bird's foot trefoil and ryegrass. And so we had 2 different situations where the cows were then fed directly on those different pastures out in the field. And then we also had those which were contained in these respiration chambers for a short period of time. It's not like a prison where they have a long sentence in there. And we measure all the inputs and outputs to get a good idea on the balance of emissions, etc. And in these situations, they were given access to the different forages. In the respiration chambers, it was fed as a haylage. So it's like a wet hay, as it were, a bit like, silage. And then, of course, with the pasture situation, they had these sniffers on, which is sniffing for this sulfur hexafluoride tracer, which is an indicator of how much methane is being produced. So let's have a look at the results then of that study. Well, what we found that those cows in those respiration chambers, they were producing significantly less methane when they were fed that wildflower haylage. And then when they were out on the pasture, we also found that grazing on those wildflower forages, they were significantly reducing their methane production as well. So it shows that this can work. So you might think that this is a win-win situation, that we've boosted biodiversity by providing those wildflowers, etc. We're putting more carbon in the soil, and then we're reducing methane as well. Well, we didn't just measure the amount of methane. There were other aspects that we considered as well. And one of the issues with the wildflower forage is that it had a reduced amount of crude protein. The digestibility of the wildflower forage was also reduced, and the cows didn't eat so much of it. They weren't like really enjoying it. So this is all of potential concern to farmers, that especially in these young dairy cows, they want them to grow rapidly so they get to maturity and then they can start milking them as soon as possible. So although that is of concern, we're not saying that you would only ever feed those cows on that diet. And so this kind of pasture could be part of a rotation that those cows go on, or if it's being fed by haylage, they're not fed the haylage all the time, that they could have some mixed in with their diet. And of course, this will also help to reduce the overall methane that those cows are producing. Now, the other aspect I alluded to earlier was that we also need to consider the other sources of forage that the livestock are consuming. And that brings me on to this study here, where a lot of cow, so dairy, beef farmers, they feed their cows at this time of year on a lot of maize silage. And maize silage is a horrid crop for biodiversity. It's very sterile. There's not much value in it at all for wildlife. And we wanted to look at alternatives of whole crop silage. And so low input barley, which was sown in the spring, was one which really performed well. It did really well in terms of the forage value compared to maize, but also for biodiversity value as well. And so this was a study in conjunction with the RSPB. And so we were assessing the plant and insect resources for farmland birds, depending on these crop types. And it was the spring barley whole crop silage which performed particularly well. And the same was shown for the birds as well. And following on from this research, it was then rolled out into the agri-environment scheme. So a nice outcome from that study. So I'm now going to move over to the last case study today, looking at sustainable fruit production. And so since arriving at Worcester, being surrounded by apple orchards and cherry orchards and all this, I've really sort of tuned into the landscape that I now find myself in. And so looking at the fruit production in the UK and elsewhere, this production is really reliant on the use of plant protection products. But they're also very reliant on pollinators as well, to not only ensure that there's adequate yields, but also to make sure that the fruit is of sufficient quality as well. Now, in cherries and apples that we studied here at Worcester, the pollination service that they require to pollinate the blossom of the cherries or the apples. Now, growers traditionally have taken this pollination service for granted. So they would put in the trees, and then they would just hope and assume that the bees from the surrounding area would turn up and pollinate the crops for them. Well, this was fine when we used to use traditional orchards, so that sort of low input, low output type system, because those orchards are being managed with wildlife in mind. Although the ultimate gain is for producing fruit, etc., they aren't managed intensively during the sort of the whole year. And so after the blossom periods, these orchards tend to continue to support pollinators in these areas, either because they are then locked up for hay, or they can be lightly grazed throughout the year. So these traditional orchards are great for wildlife, and they support bees throughout the year. But because we need to be creating more food and increasing food production, we've had to move over to this modern orchard system. And these are so different to what we know and compared to the traditional orchards. Now, in these modern orchard situations, the resources available to pollinators is mainly limited to that blossom period. And so management practices outside of that do not allow wildflowers to flourish, which would otherwise be providing resources for the pollinators in the area. And so this is an issue, because the pollinators, well, it's not a happy place to be a bee. There's nothing for them to feed on, so they leave the area. There's nothing for them in these modern orchards. So what this means is that growers are now highly dependent on a service for which they have limited control. Now, just to sort of delve into this a bit more and understanding the problem. So let's imagine this is outlined in the yellow, a grower's set of orchards here. And in the surrounding landscape, there are certain areas with an X which are not supporting pollinators, so not supporting a great diversity or abundance of pollinators. But there are some areas in terms of how they're being managed that are really good for pollinators, which is great for this grower, because when it comes to the blossom period, those pollinators in the surrounding landscape can come and pollinate the blossoms of those trees, and the grower's happy and all is good. Now, the thing is here is that grower has no control of anything outside of their boundary. And so the surrounding farmers, for whatever reason, could decide to change the land use. So the price of wheat may go up, and then they convert from pasture to arable, for example. And this ultimately affects the abundance of pollinators in the landscape. And so when it comes to that blossom period, what the grower will then find is, well, there aren't so many bees to move into the orchards, and so yields and fruit quality drop off quite substantially. Well, of course, there are these quick fixes that growers are now having to rely on to take back control of their pollination, of their fruit crops. They are having to buy in honeybee hives, and believe it or not, you can even buy boxes of bumblebees to put in your orchards. Now, this really is a quick fix, and it's not really sustainable. It's reliant on those growers bringing in those pollinators year after year. And for me, it doesn't address the key issue as to why there isn't sufficient pollination in the orchards in the first place. And that's because we are losing, and we have lost so much of the diversity and abundance of the forage species, the wildflowers that these pollinators, the wild pollinators, need to forage on, so the nectar, the pollen, but also areas for them to nest as well. So we'll park up the idea on the pollinators for a moment. I just want to go through on the issues of pesticide use in orchards before coming together with both of those concepts and how we can take this all forward. So pesticide use in orchards, particularly in fruit trees, is incredibly high. So in Europe, fruit trees receive the second most highest amount of pesticides per hectare, second only to grapes, so grape production. So pesticide use has generally increased, but crop losses have still remained fairly similar. Some products are being withdrawn due to changes in regulation, which is good to hear. But some pests are also becoming increasingly resistant to insecticides. So going forward, looking at sustainable approaches, it's clear that we need to have alternative strategies to take the industry forward. And so this is where those natural enemies, those beneficial species, come in. So the approach then that we've tried successfully in orchards is looking at how we can boost the abundance and diversity of pollinators in these systems, and also boost the abundance and diversity of natural enemies. So those insects which will eat the crop pests in the apple orchards, etc. And how we've gone about this is that, well, we're giving back control to the growers by allowing them to put in wildflower habitat into their orchard, so they're not reliant so much on what's going on in the surrounding landscape. And we've done this in apple orchards, we've done this in sweet cherry orchards, and this was under polytunnel systems as well. And we've also done this in southern Spain in orange orchards as well. And here are some of the pictures of the habitats that we've created in these situations. Now, for the purpose of today, I'm going to now focus on the story for the cherry orchards. It's a particularly interesting one. So this is a result of a PhD project by who is Dr. Theos Matios Fierro, and it was a study in collaboration with Reading Uni, NIAB EMR, and funded by Berry Gardens, Waitrose, and also the University of Worcester. Now, this was following on from our study in apple orchards, and so we wanted to develop the use of wildflower strips in orchards. We wanted to take it to the next level, and so we wanted to see, well, how can we maximize the benefits that can be afforded by putting wildflower strips into these orchards? And so, yeah, this was the first time anyone's looked at putting wildflower strips into polytunnel systems. And straight away, we wanted to have an approach that works with growers. We were concerned that if we allow vegetation to grow tall under these plastic covers, then we could be increasing humidity and therefore the incidence of fungal disease, which of course would then mean that growers would have to use more fungicides. And that was certainly something that we didn't want to see happen. But we also needed to have an approach that was not going to impede the movement of growers. So when they're inspecting the crops, but also during the cherry harvest in late July, August, we didn't want to make it difficult for the workers to move along the alleyways to pick the cherries, and for the punnets of the cherries to get contaminated with plant matter and things like that. So what we did in this study, we had 3 different treatments, and one of them was the control. So this was business as normal, where growers will go in and they will cut their alleyways every 3 to 4 weeks across the growing season. And then we compared it with conventional wildflower strips, where growers were allowed to leave them uncut throughout the season. So they did grow tall in that situation. And then we have our very novel treatment of actively managed wildflower strips, where growers had to keep those wildflower strips maintained at a height of only 20 centimetres throughout the growing season. So we did this research in Herefordshire and Staffordshire, and we basically had our 3 treatments in 2 different orchard blocks at each of those sites. And our wildflower mix that we sowed was consisted of these species here, all known to support our pollinators, different types of pollinators, but also some of our beneficial species as well. And we were also using native wildflower species, and they were all perennial. We didn't want to have a system where we were planting annual species in these mixes, because we'd have to cultivate those alleyways every year to maintain those annuals there. And of course, that will release any carbon that we're locking up in the soil. So that would be counterproductive. So to give you an idea of the pollinators of sweet cherry, the first 2 sort of big players here are those which the growers are paying for. So the honeybees and also these boxes of buff-tailed bumblebees. But we're also recording other species of bumblebees, solitary bees, and also hoverflies. Now, most of those pollinators were visiting the cherry blossom when that was out. Some of them were visiting the wildflowers as well, so the solitary bees. Some were just flying around in the orchards, and some were having a rest as well. But we're interested in, well, we got our wildflower strip treatments. How did our pollinators respond to having those in place? Was it worthwhile? So here what we see is our control. So business as normal, so the abundance of pollinators, and this is for our actively managed, so 20 centimetre high strips compared to our tall, it could be 1 metre tall wildflower strips. And what we found is that when growers were cutting them regularly, we had a significant increase in the number of pollinators in those orchards. And the study was done for 3 years. And what we found that by the 3rd year of the study, once those wildflower strips had really got well established, lots of blossoms, etc., we were really then starting to increase the pollinators in those systems. Now, after the cherry blossom period is when we want to be supporting these pollinators in the orchards so that they survive and they're around to produce spring, which can then do the pollination the following year. And so once again, with our wildflower treatments, we were seeing significantly greater number of pollinators where we had our wildflower strips in these polytunnels. And then once again, year on year increases in those pollinators. So we were boosting the number of pollinators in these cherry orchards year on year. So this is really important for growers. We've been able to show that if they have these wildflower strips in, then they are supporting pollinators. So they are boosting those overall local populations of pollinators in these systems, which is great. So we also wanted to see what was going on with our natural enemies, because this would then allow us to say, well, is there potential for you to reduce the amount of insecticides you're using? And so we looked at the abundance of natural enemies in the cherry trees themselves. And what we found is that when we had our wildflower strips in those situations, we were boosting the number of natural enemies in the adjacent cherry trees. And then we were also boosting our natural enemies in those wildflower strips in the orchards as well. So they were going on those wildflower strips, and then they were moving on to the cherry trees as well, which we would then hope they would find the pests of those cherries. And as we saw with the pollinators, we also saw a year-on-year increase in the abundance of our natural enemies. So over time, we were boosting the populations of these in these cherry orchards. And likewise in the alleyways, as those wildflower strips got better and better, we had a gradual increase in the abundance of natural enemies in those situations. So really important for growers. We've shown that we've not only boosted our pollinators, but we've also boosted the natural enemies. Well, Just because you've got the natural enemies there in your orchard, it doesn't mean they're doing any pest regulation, so helping you to control your pests. So what we did here is that we used these baited cards where aphids, the dead aphids, were stuck to these cards. And then we looked at how many were depleted, so how many were removed from these cards by natural enemies. And so we looked at these according to the different treatments. And what we found is that where we had our wildflower strips, the percentage of aphids which were removed from those cards was significantly greater where we had those wildflower strips compared to business as normal. And we saw that in June and we saw that in July. So straight away, this is indicating that growers perhaps could go easier on those insecticides during those months because we're actually getting good control by our natural enemies in those situations. So just to conclude then, research at the University of Worcester is really helping to deliver sustainable solutions for the management of agricultural land. And ultimately what this comes down to is that it's going to benefit human well-being. Our research is demonstrating the importance of managing habitats correctly, and this will therefore ensure that we have positive outcomes, because if you don't have positive outcomes, it's very difficult to sell these ideas to growers, to farmers. It's got to work for everyone if we are to take this forward. Such approaches can also be readily applied to other systems. And so this year I'm hoping to secure the last pieces of money for a study in UK grape production to help make that a more sustainable sector, especially because it's increasing exponentially at the moment. And I'm also looking to work with the British hop industry in how we can make that sector more sustainable going forward in the production of British hops as well. So the title of my talk today was Sustainable Food Production, Is It Possible? Well, yes, but one thing that is really clear is that we do need to reduce our demands on natural resources, because the more pressure we put on those resources, the harder it is going to be for us to achieve sustainable food production. So we all really do need to consider our own impacts on the planet. And this raises a very interesting question of, well, what is the perfect consumer? I think from today, you may have got the idea from me that perhaps being vegan, if everyone was to be vegan, then perhaps that means that we wouldn't be perfect consumers, because how are we going to get more carbon in the soil? We're going to have more arable land in cultivation, so there's going to be more carbon being released from those soils. So what do we do? How much red meat should we be eating? Should we be avoiding certain products? Should we be thinking about food miles? So plant-based diets. You know, if we're buying most of that plant protein from South America, from North America, well, how does that then impact and make that food sustainable in that approach? So there is so much to consider. And answering that question of what is the perfect consumer, I don't think anyone could ever be the perfect consumer. I think it's all about having a balance in society, so that yes, you do have the vegans, you do have those which are eating some red meat, etc. And so as a whole, we can then take this forward in a more sustainable way. So just to acknowledge some of the partners on the research that I've mentioned today, but also some of the funders of that research. And one last thing I have to mention, I'm afraid, I'm the course leader for our BSc in Environmental Management and Sustainability. So if this is something that you're really interested in and you want to find out more about sustainable approaches, etc., then please consider studying our course. If you want to start in September of this year, the UCAS deadline is the 26th of January, so not long to go. But yeah, a fascinating course where you can get to discuss and address many of these questions that I've raised today. But I'm more than happy now to answer any questions that you may have. And so I will stop sharing my screen so I can see what questions have come into the chat. So thank you very much. Are there any questions? Hello. Are there anyone got any questions?
If you're not sure where the chat box is, guys, the purple bar at the bottom right, you should be able to pop that out, and the chat box is just there.
No. Well, hopefully I've answered all the questions that you may have had. So
probably have. To be fair, that was very in depth. Thank you very much.
Great.
A few minutes. Anyone who wants to watch this back, like if they want to use it for want to re-watch any of the research or see any of the graphs in great detail, it will be going on the UCH YouTube channel. That link will be emailed out hopefully in the next week or so. Everyone who's signed up, they'll be sent that. For the ones who've missed it, we'll be able to get it as well, and I'll send it to you as well, Duncan. Okay. Okay,
great. Oh, thank you very much, Hannah. Just reading your comment there.
Okay, so if we've got no questions, I think we can wrap it up there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for attending, and yeah, take care, everyone.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.